You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Since the late 1930s, groups within the German army and the military intelligence were secretly working to topple the government. Key figures in these early plots included Major General Hans Oster, who was the second in command at the Military Intelligence Office, Colonel General Ludwig Beck, previously the chief of the German Army High Command, and Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who had commanded the First Army and the Western Army Command. These military conspirators reached out to influential civilians such as Karl Gordeler, former mayor of Leipzig, and Helmuth James von Moltke, a relative of the renowned Moltke the Elder. Discussion groups sprang up, like the one at the Kreisau Circle at the von Moltke estate, where civilians and military dissidents met. Von Moltke himself opposed assassinating Hitler, preferring a legal trial. He famously remarked, "We are all amateurs and would only bungle it," and pointed out the hypocrisy in replicating Hitler's moral crimes. Despite the plans laid out in 1938 and 1939 to prevent another world war and remove Hitler, hesitations by high-ranking officers like Franz Halder and Walther von Brauchitsch, and the late response of Western nations to Hitler's aggression, delayed any action. By 1942, Colonel Henning von Tresckow had formed a core resistance group within the army. As a member of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's staff, Tresckow was perfectly positioned to recruit fellow oppositionists to this cause, turning it into the epicenter of military dissent. The major challenge was reaching Hitler, who was meticulously protected at all times. Nevertheless, in 1942, Tresckow and Oster managed to reconstruct a robust network of resistors. A significant addition to their ranks was General Friedrich Olbricht, who oversaw the General Army Office and had access to a widespread independent communication network to reserve units. Tresckow and Olbricht hatched a plan to kill Hitler with a bomb during his visit to the Army Group Center's headquarters in March 1943, known as Operation Spark. Unfortunately, this bomb, along with a subsequent attempt, failed to explode, greatly discouraging the conspirators. Throughout 1943, Tresckow tirelessly sought to enlist influential commanders like Field Marshals Erich von Manstein and Gerd von Rundstedt, though he found it challenging to secure their unwavering support. Tresckow occasionally convinced Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, to consider action against Hitler, but Kluge wavered at critical moments. Remarkably, none of these high-ranking officers betrayed the plotters by reporting them to the Gestapo or Hitler. Let's talk about those who opposed Hitler and the Nazi policies. The main aim of the group behind the July 20th plot was to get rid of Hitler, and they had different reasons for wanting that. These plotters were mostly conservative nationalists, not really looking for a democracy. Martin Borchardt explains that they were high-class individuals who lost their influence with the Nazis during the war and wanted their power back. But for someone like Stauffenberg, it was also about the dishonor the Nazis' brutal actions brought upon Germany, especially its treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. Historian Judith Michel describes these dissenters as a mix of people from different political backgrounds: liberal Democrats, conservatives, social democrats, high-class authoritarians, and even communists, who all shared the same goal: to topple Hitler and end the war. Evidence suggests that this group had a range of members. For instance, in April, before the coup attempt, Stauffenberg was willing to work together with the Communist Party in Germany, making connections through social democrats like Adolf Reichwein and Julius Lieber. When we look at territorial issues, the plotters had some pretty big demands for the Allies, such as returning to Germany's borders from before World War I with Belgium, France, and Poland, and they didn't want to pay any reparations. The Allies probably wouldn't have agreed to that. The plotters, like many others who resisted the Nazis, believed in a bigger Germany. They wanted the Allies to at least agree to acknowledging the inclusion of areas like Austria, Alsace-Lorraine, the Sudetenland, and territories acquired from Poland, as well as some overseas colonies. They envisioned Europe under German control. Regarding Poland, the plotters had different views. While most wanted Germany's borders from 1914, others thought those demands were a stretch and needed adjustment. One plotter even suggested taking over all of Poland. These nationalistic goals were seen by the fighting Poles as not much different from Hitler's own racist policies. Stauffenberg himself, 5 years before the coup, during the Poland campaign in 1939, emphasized the need for systematic colonization in Poland. As for the political future they envisioned after Hitler, many conspirators had actually helped the Nazis rise to power and shared similar foreign policy ideas as Hitler. Even at the time of the plot, they weren't looking to set up a democracy. They hoped to replace Hitler with a conservative, authoritarian government that would include aristocratic rule without involving the general public too much in running the state. By the middle of 1943, it was clear that Germany's position in the war was worsening. This led several high-ranking military officers and their civilian supporters to the conclusion that Hitler needed to be killed. They hoped that by doing this, they could establish a new government that the Western Allies would accept and negotiate peace to avoid the Soviet Union from taking over Germany. In August 1943, one of the conspirators, Tresckow, met Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg for the first time. Stauffenberg was a young staff officer who had been gravely injured in North Africa. Despite being a determined German patriot with conservative views, he believed that Germany was headed for disaster and that removing Hitler was a necessity. After the devastating defeat at Stalingrad in December 1942, Stauffenberg, even with his moral reservations, felt that assassinating Hitler would be a lesser evil compared to allowing him to continue in power. Stauffenberg's involvement brought a sense of urgency to the resistance efforts. When Tresckow was sent to the Eastern Front, Stauffenberg became responsible for planning and carrying out the assassination plot. Among the plans for overthrowing Hitler was a new tactic proposed by Ulbricht, another conspirator. He suggested using Operation Valkyrie, an emergency plan created by the replacement army designed to maintain order in case of civil unrest or an uprising by forced laborers. Ulbricht saw this as an opportunity to deploy the reserve army for the coup. Tresckow took on the task of revising the Valkyrie plan and its supplementary orders between August and September 1943. They crafted a secret declaration stating that Hitler was dead and that a group of corrupt party leaders was trying to take control. The plan gave detailed orders to take over key Nazi locations, including government buildings, radio stations, and concentration camps. Although previously it was believed that Stauffenberg was the main architect of the Valkyrie plan, documents released in 2007 indicate that Tresckow had developed it by autumn 1943. These sensitive documents were managed by Trescow's wife, Erika, and his secretary, both taking precautions to not leave any fingerprints. Tresckow had already made a couple of failed attempts to kill Hitler, first trying to shoot him and then considering poisoning him. However, these plans failed as they realized Hitler was heavily protected against such attempts, which led them to decide a time bomb was the best method. For the Valkyrie plan to work, they needed the support of General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army, or otherwise find a way to incapacitate him. Between 1943 and early 1944, Tresckow and Stauffenberg coordinated a minimum of 5 assassination attempts involving close encounters with Hitler using hand grenades, bombs, or a gun. These attempts were made on March 13, 1943 by von Tresckow, March 21, 1943 by von Gersdorf, late November 1943 by von den Busche-Streithorst, February 1944 by von Kleist-Schmenzen, March 11, 1944 by von Breitenbuch. Yet, as Germany's defeat seemed more likely, Hitler became even more reclusive. He stayed away from the public eye and rarely visited Berlin, spending most of his time at his fortified headquarters in East Prussia and occasionally at his retreat in Bavaria. These locations were heavily secured, and Hitler only met with individuals he fully trusted. The Gestapo, led by Himmler, grew ever more suspicious of potential assassination plots, especially those that might involve the officers of the General Staff, a group that was indeed plotting against him. In the thick of World War II, by the summer of 1944, those plotting against Hitler were feeling the heat from the Gestapo. Concerned about the effectiveness of their plan, Stauffenberg reached out to Tresckow with a critical question through Lieutenant Heinrich Graf von Lehndorff-Steinort. He wondered if taking Hitler's life was worthwhile, since it seemed unlikely to achieve any political aims. Tresckow's reply underscored the moral imperative over the practical. In his words, the assassination must be attempted, coûte que coûte, whatever the cost. Even if it fails, we must take action in Berlin, for the practical purpose no longer matters. What matters now is that the German resistance movement must take the plunge before the eyes of the world and of history. Compared to that, nothing else matters. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler, a top Nazi official, seemed to play a strange game. In August of 1943, he had a conversation with Johannes Popitz, the Prussian finance minister connected to Gordeler's resistance network. Popitz proposed supporting Himmler if he would overthrow Hitler and help end the war. The meeting seemingly led nowhere, and though Popitz would eventually face execution, he wasn't immediately apprehended. Himmler didn't pursue the resistance he knew existed within the government. It's suspected that Himmler might have let the assassination plot progress, believing he could take over if Hitler were removed and negotiate peace, given the bleak outlook of the war. The opposition also considered Himmler as a possible inside contact. General von Bock pointed Tresckow in Himmler's direction, but there's no proof they ever connected. Gordeler also seemed to have a line to Himmler through a mutual friend, Karl Langbin. Some, like Wilhelm Canaris's biographer Heinz Hohne, theorized that Canaris and Himmler may have been collaborating to change the regime, but this idea is not based on concrete evidence. For Tresckow and the core group against Hitler, it wasn't enough to just remove Hitler. They also wanted to take out Himmler, whom they greatly feared. In fact, Stauffenberg once had to call off an assassination attempt because Himmler wasn't there with Hitler. The plan was clear. Both had to go. In the first week of July, starting with July 1st, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg landed a crucial role as the Chief of Staff to General Fromm at the Reserve Army's Berlin headquarters. This position meant Stauffenberg could join Hitler's military meetings, which took place either in Wolf's Lair in East Prussia or in Berchtesgaden. This appointment gave Stauffenberg a chance, likely his final one, to assassinate Hitler using a bomb or a gun. At the same time, the conspiracy to take down Hitler was gaining key supporters, like General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, who commanded German forces in France. He was prepared to take over in Paris once Hitler was eliminated, with the hope of quickly arranging a ceasefire with the advancing Allied armies. Discussing the aborted attempts, by July 7, 1944, the plotters were ready to act. General Helmuth Stief was supposed to kill Hitler at a costume display at Klesheim Castle near Salzburg, couldn't go through with it. Now Stauffenberg took it upon himself to both kill Hitler and manage the conspiracy in Berlin. He brought a bomb to a conference with Hitler on July 14th, but he waited because the plot required eliminating SS leader Heinrich Himmler and Luftwaffe head Hermann Göring at the same time to ensure Operation Valkyrie's success. It wasn't normal for Himmler to attend these meetings, though. By July 15th, the planners had scrapped the condition to kill Himmler and Göring alongside Hitler. The strategy was for Stauffenberg to plant a bomb with a timer in Hitler's conference room, leave under an excuse, and then escape back to Berlin after the explosion to take charge with the other conspirators. They'd then activate Operation Valkyrie, have the Reserve Army seize control over Germany, and arrest other high-ranking Nazis. Beck would serve as the interim head of state, Gordeler as the chancellor, and Witzleben as the head of the armed forces. Yet again on July 15th, everything was called off at the last second because Hitler left the room just in time, although Himmler and Göring were there. Luckily, Stauffenberg managed to snatch the bomb back, avoiding its detection. On the 18th of July, a troubling rumor made its way to Stauffenberg that his involvement in a plot against Hitler might have been discovered by the Gestapo, leading to his arrest. Although these concerns weren't confirmed to be true, there was a growing sense of urgency that if there was going to be an attempt on Hitler's life, it had to happen soon, as there might not be another chance. On the Thursday morning of July 20th, Stauffenberg took a flight back to Hitler's headquarters, known as the Wolf's Lair, with a bomb packed in his briefcase in anticipation of a military meeting with Hitler. The day was exceptionally hot, and by around 12:30 p.m., the meeting time, Stauffenberg was soaked with sweat. He excused himself to a washroom in Wilhelm Keitel's office under the guise of needing to change his shirt. With the help of von Heften and a pair of pliers, Stauffenberg activated a bomb by crushing the end of a pencil detonator, which was designed to release a firing pin within 10 minutes. The device was challenging to arm due to the severe wounds Stauffenberg had suffered during the war, including the loss of an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. A guard soon interrupted, knocking to indicate the meeting was starting, preventing Stauffenberg from arming a second bomb, which he then passed over to his aide, Werner von Heften. Stauffenberg managed to place the armed bomb inside his briefcase and entered the conference room, placing it near Hitler. A few minutes later, he left the room using a prearranged phone call as an excuse. It is believed that Colonel Heinz Brandt, who was standing beside Hitler, accidentally saved Hitler's life by moving the briefcase behind a table leg with his foot, thereby shielding Hitler from the brunt of the explosion. This action, however, cost Brandt his life. The bomb went off at 12:42, leveling the conference room and instantly killing a stenographer, injuring more than 20 others and leading to the death of 3 officers from their injuries. Despite this, Hitler made it through with injuries including burns, a perforated eardrum, common among the 24 people present, and irritation in his right eye. Hitler's physician, Theodor Morell, treated him with penicillin, which he had in supply from seized Allied medical stock. Morell was particularly cautious, given that he had seen the lethal effects of sepsis when Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated 2 years before. Kurt Salterberg, guarding the area, watched Stauffenberg exit the conference building, which was not unusual because people often stepped out for documents. Shortly after, Salterberg witnessed an explosion with a cloud of smoke, pieces of wood and paper flying, and men being thrown out of windows and doors. Believing Hitler had been killed in the blast, Stauffenberg and his aide Werner von Heften hurriedly left the scene in a car. They managed to convincingly get past 3 checkpoints and left the Wolf's Lair complex. Along the way, von Heften threw a second unprimed bomb into some woods. They reached the airfield quickly, avoiding suspicion, and by 1 p.m., Stauffenberg was on a plane, a Heinkel He 111, arranged by General Eduard Wagner. Upon arriving in Berlin around 4 p.m., there was conflicting information. General Erich Feldgiebel, co-conspirator back at the Wolf's Lair, had already called the Bendler Block, the conspirators' headquarters, informing them that Hitler survived. Despite this, Stauffenberg called from the airport, insisting Hitler was dead. The confounded plotters at the Bendler Block were unsure who to believe. At 4 p.m., Ulbricht gave orders to initiate Operation Valkyrie, but hesitance was in the air. When General Fromm, grabbed by suspicion, reached out to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, he learned for certain that Hitler was alive. Keitel's inquiry about Stauffenberg's whereabouts signaled to Fromm that the failed assassination was linked to his command, putting him in great danger. Fromm, trying to appear loyal, falsely stated he believed Stauffenberg was with Hitler. Elsewhere, in occupied France, Karl Heinrich von Stolpnagel succeeded in disarming the SD and SS and capturing their leaders. He reached out to Günther von Kluge to suggest contacting the Allies, but learned Hitler was indeed alive. When Stauffenberg and Heften arrived at the Bendler Block at 4:40 p.m., Fromm, seeking to protect himself, tried to have Stauffenberg arrested. But Ulbricht and Stauffenberg managed to hold Fromm at gunpoint, and Ulbricht then designated General Erich Hübner to take over Fromm's duties. By then, Himmler had control of the situation, reversing Operation Valkyrie's orders. Yet in many places the revolt continued as officers believed Hitler was dead. In Berlin, conspirator and city commandant General Paul von Haas had his troops secure important streets and arrest Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. Similarly, in Vienna, Prague, and elsewhere, Nazi party offices were seized, and party officials and SS officers were detained. Around 6:10 p.m., General Joachim von Kortzfleisch, who was in charge of Military District 3 in Berlin, was called into the Bendler Block. He was upset and kept yelling, "The Führer is alive," rejecting the orders given by Ulbricht, which led to his arrest and detainment. General Karl Freier von Thungen replaced him but didn't really contribute. General Fritz Lindemann was supposed to deliver a speech on the radio, but he never showed up, and since he had the only script, Beck had to quickly write another one. By 7 p.m., Hitler had recovered enough to make phone calls. He reached out to Goebbels at the propaganda ministry, who then put him in touch with Major Riemer, the officer in charge of the troops outside the ministry. Hitler confirmed he was alive to Riemer and directed him to take back control in Berlin. Riemer's troops encircled the Bendler Block but didn't enter the building. At 8 p.m., Witzleben arrived there furiously, had a heated exchange with Stauffenberg, who still believed the coup could work. Witzleben stormed out soon after. Around that same time, the takeover attempt that was planned in Paris got called off because Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who just got named commander-in-chief in the West, found out Hitler was alive. As Remmler retook control over Berlin and it became known that Hitler wasn't dead, those in Berlin who were less committed to the coup started switching sides. Fromm, who had been locked up, was set free, and violence erupted in the Bendler Block between those for and against the coup. Stauffenberg was injured in the gunfire. During the chaos, Remmler and his troops got to the Bendler Block, and the rebels were quickly subdued and taken into custody. By 11 p.m., Fromm and Remmler had the building under control again. Looking to show his fierce loyalty, perhaps to save himself, Fromm hastily put together a military tribunal with himself as the judge and sentenced Ulbricht, Stauffenberg, Heften, and another officer, Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, to death. He also placed Beck under arrest. Beck, realizing it was all over, asked for a pistol and tried to end his life, but he only injured himself at first. Soldiers then shot him in the neck, killing him. He was the first of many who would attempt suicide in the days to follow. Although Remmler protested because Hitler had instructed him to arrest the plotters, the 4 officers were shot to death in the courtyard just after midnight on July 21st, likely to keep them quiet about Fromm's role in the plot. More executions might have happened, but at 12:30 a.m., Waffen-SS forces led by Otto Skorzeny arrived and put a stop to any further killings. In the weeks following an attempt on Hitler's life, a frenzied Hitler and his Gestapo, led by Himmler, swiftly apprehended nearly everyone even slightly linked to the conspiracy. Found letters and diaries exposed earlier plots from 1938, 1939, and 1943, which led to more arrests, including Colonel General Franz Halder, who was sent to a concentration camp. New laws meant relatives of the conspirators were arrested too. In total, over 7,000 were detained and 4,980 faced execution, some being targeted by the Gestapo for unrelated reasons. Alfons Heck, once a member of the Hitler Youth and later a historian, reflected the anger many Germans felt towards the plotters, despite not all being Hitler's supporters or members of the Nazi Party. They saw Hitler as the only one who could steer Germany out of its dire military situation at the time. While Allied radio speculated on other suspects, few plotters tried to flee or denied their guilt. Those that survived the Gestapo's interrogation faced the People's Court, where Judge Roland Freisler, a fervent Nazi, often berated the defendants. The trials were a formality, with a verdict favoring the prosecution guaranteed. Military officers were dishonorably discharged in a rigged court-martial before being sent for trial. August 7th and 8th, 1944, marked the start of these trials, with Hitler demanding a degrading death for the guilty. Several, including Kluge and Stulpnagel, took their own lives. Tresckow committed suicide using a grenade. Tresckow's parting words were resolute, declaring Hitler as the world's archenemy, and was convinced they had done the right thing, undaunted by the thought of facing God with their decisions. Fromm's execution of Stauffenberg and others backfired, highlighting his own inaction and failure to report the plot. He was sentenced and shot by a firing squad on Hitler's order. Others, including Erwin Planck, the son of physicist Max Planck, met the same fate. A report suggested Pope Pius XII was part of the conspiracy and revealed that some plotters had previously foiled an alleged plan by Hitler to harm the Pope. SA member Wolf Heinrich Graf von Helldorf, Berlin's Orpo police chief, had minimal impact on the events of July 20th but was later convicted of treason and executed. After Freisler's death in February 1945, formal trials ceased, but Canaris's diary discovery in April led to more implicated and executed individuals, right up to the war's end. Viewing his survival as divinely ordained, Hitler commissioned a special decoration in 3 classes for the July 20th casualties. The Wound Badge of the 20th of July 1944 was a rare award, each signed by Hitler. Major Rimmer, who thwarted the coup, rose through the rank and later became a neo-Nazi figure. Philipp von Boiselager, the provider of the explosives, eluded capture and outlived the war, as did Ewald Heinrich von Kleist-Schmenzen. Following the failed coup, all Wehrmacht soldiers recommitted their oaths to Hitler, and the military salute was replaced with the Hitler salute. It's tough to figure out exactly how much World War II Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was part of the efforts within the German military to resist Hitler or the 20th of July plot take him down. Since the main leaders who knew the inside scoop didn't make it and there's not much paperwork left behind, we're left with more questions than answers. Historians can't agree on Rommel's role. Peter Hoffman tells us that Rommel had become a serious critic of Hitler and was backing the plot to overthrow him, even though he wasn't for the idea of killing Hitler. Rommel had a lot of military and political contacts in France, which made him kind of an unofficial leader against Hitler there. Ralph Georg Reuth, on the other hand, thinks Rommel might have misunderstood the plotters, who didn't often talk about killing Hitler directly. Since Rommel was quite naive and deeply connected to Hitler, Reuth suggests Rommel wouldn't have thought a violent upheaval in Berlin meant assassination. According to the post-war stories from Karl Strolin, who was the mayor of Stuttgart, efforts to get Rommel on board with the anti-Hitler conspiracy started early in 1944. When Rommel's new chief of staff, Hans Speidel, showed up in Normandy on April 15, 1944, he put Rommel back in touch with one of the key players, Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel. Speidel was introduced to the plotters because of his new job with Rommel. The plotters really wanted a high-ranking guy like a field marshal on their side. Speidel was then given the task of convincing Rommel to join their cause. On May 27th, Speidel had a chat in Germany with former Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath and Strolin, with the meeting supposedly called by Rommel, although Rommel didn't show up. They talked about potentially surrendering to the Western Allies, and Speidel said Rommel was cool with discussing the idea further. However, there was a disconnect because in Berlin, the plotters didn't know Rommel was supposedly willing to work with them. In fact, on May 16th, they told Alan Dulles, an American contact, that Rommel was not in. Then, a few days before their assassination attempt, Rommel was seriously hurt when his car was shot up by an Allied plane, and on the day of the plot, he was out of action due to his injuries. After the war, Rommel's widow insisted he was against killing Hitler because he thought it would lead to a civil war in Germany. Journalist William L. Shirer claimed Rommel was in the know but wanted Hitler arrested and put on trial instead. Historian Ian Beckett is skeptical and thinks Rommel probably didn't know much about the plot, while Ralph Gore-Groith argues that there's no sign Rommel was really involved. Richard J. Evans also agrees Rommel was clued into a plot but didn't play any part in it. Everyone agrees that the 20th of July bomb plot's failure had big consequences. Tons of the conspirators were caught and thousands more got pulled into the investigation. Rommel became a suspect mainly because he was connected to another suspect, Kluge. Under torture, Stülpnagel and Hofacker pointed at Rommel, and some planning documents by Gordler listed him as a potential ally. According to Hofacker's forced confession, Rommel had agreed to push for Hitler to step down, and if he didn't, Rommel would join the effort to overthrow him. Also, Gordler's papers tagged Rommel to be part of the new government once Hitler was out of the picture. Hitler knew it would be a huge scandal if the German people found out Rommel was part of the treason. So, he gave Rommel a choice between a lethal pill or getting dragged through a trial that would surely end with a death sentence. Either way, it was bleak, but a trial would have also meant terrible repercussions for Rommel's family. On October 14, 1944, facing this terrible situation, Rommel chose to end his life. He was honored with a full military funeral, his family was left alone, and the true reason for his death stayed under wraps until after the war was over. Historians have delved into the backgrounds of the conspirators involved in the plot on July 20th and their roles in wartime crimes. Christian Gerlach, in particular, has demonstrated that these plotters, including personalities like Treschow and Gersdorf, were aware of the mass killings in Eastern Europe as early as 1941. Gerlach references sources that suggest a story in which SS officers supposedly concealed their killings or made threats to silence officers who protested, but he labels this concept as nonsense. Moreover, Treschow was responsible for authorizing orders that dispatched thousands of orphans to forced labor, known as the Hay Action, an aspect that casts doubts on the genuine intentions of the conspirators. For some historians, the activities of the conspirators, such as Treschow, were more connected to the military circumstances than to a direct opposition to the Nazi regime's atrocities or war crimes. And while there was recognition of the moral indignation over the extermination of Jews, there was less concern for the mass killing of civilians in the East. Gerlach suggests that the primary aim of the conspirators was either to ensure a German victory or to prevent a defeat at the very least. Supporting Gerlach's perspective, historian Hans Mommsen has declared that the conspirators were chiefly concerned with military triumph. Nonetheless, other academics have contested this viewpoint. Peter Hoffman from McGill University and Klaus-Jochen Arnold of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, for example, argue that Gerlach's interpretation is overly simplistic. Critique also arises from Danny Orbach, a historian at Harvard in the year 2011, who claimed that Gerlach's analysis of the sources was partial, occasionally directly contradicting what they expressly indicate. Orbach points out that Gerlach had inaccurately rephrased the memoirs of Colonel Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, a member of the resistance, and cited an SS document in a deceiving manner, causing him to conclude that Gerlach's hypothesis on the German resistance is not dependable. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.